The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet street as Agent Olivia Carter drove home after a long shift at the FBI field office. Clad in a simple hoodie and jeans, she hardly looked the part of a top federal investigator. But inside her glove compartment lay an official FBI badge, a symbol of her hard-earned authority. As she neared an intersection, flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. A sharp sigh left her lips. Another traffic stop. She pulled over, her heartbeat steady, but her mind racing. A tall, burly officer, Sergeant James Reynolds, swaggered toward her car, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon. His smirk was evident even before he spoke. "License and registration, and keep your hands where I can see them." Olivia calmly reached for her purse. Before she could even unzip it, Reynolds unlatched his gun. "Nice and slow, lady. Don't try anything funny," he sneered. Olivia frowned, keeping her movements precise. "I'm just getting my ID." But Reynolds wasn't interested in explanations. He took one look at her, a black woman in an expensive car, and decided she was a threat. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice laced with amusement. "Don't make me repeat myself." Olivia clenched her jaw. She'd seen officers like him before, drunk on power, thinking they could do whatever they wanted. She complied, slowly stepping out, hands visible. Reynolds took a step back, gripping his gun tighter. "What's the matter, officer?" she asked, her voice cool. Reynolds chuckled. "You tell me. A woman like you driving a car like this smells like trouble." Olivia knew exactly where this was going, but Reynolds had no idea who he had just pulled over. Sergeant James Reynolds circled Olivia like a predator sizing up its prey. His smirk widened as he gestured toward her car. "This your vehicle?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Olivia kept her expression neutral. "Yes, officer. Registered in my name. You can check." Reynolds scoffed. "Oh, I will. But first, hands on the hood." Olivia exhaled slowly. She wasn't about to let this escalate, but she also wasn't about to be bullied. "Officer, I have identification that will clear this up immediately. I'm reaching into my back pocket." Reynolds didn't even let her finish. "I said hands on the hood," he barked, stepping forward aggressively, his gun now fully drawn. The tension in the air was suffocating. Olivia's muscles tensed, but she remained composed. "I'm an FBI agent," she stated firmly. "My badge is in my pocket. If you just—" Reynolds laughed, a cold, dismissive laugh. "Oh, you're FBI? Yeah, sure, and I'm the president," he mocked. "Lady, I've heard every excuse in the book. You think flashing some fake badge is going to get you out of this?" Olivia's fingers curled into fists, but she kept her voice even. "Check my credentials, right now." Reynolds shook his head. "Nah, I don't take orders from criminals." He stepped closer, his gun now inches from her chest. Olivia could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This man didn't care about facts. He had already decided what she was, just another black person who needed to be put in their place. She took a slow breath. "Sergeant Reynolds, I strongly advise you to verify my ID before you make the biggest mistake of your career." Reynolds smirked again. "Oh, sweetheart, the only mistake here is thinking you can outsmart me." What he didn't realize? Backup was already on the way, and this time it wasn't for her. Olivia's heartbeat remained steady, but her mind was calculating every possible outcome. She had dealt with men like Reynolds before, cocky, reckless, and convinced of their own power. Reynolds still had his gun aimed at her. His finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. "Last warning, hands on the hood, or I'll make sure you regret it," he sneered. Olivia didn't move. Instead, she locked eyes with him and said, "Sergeant, you have exactly 1 minute to put that weapon away before this situation turns against you." Reynolds let out another arrogant chuckle. "Oh yeah? And who's going to stop me? You?" Without breaking eye contact, Olivia tilted her head slightly and spoke in a calm but commanding voice. "Control, this is Agent Olivia Carter, badge number 9276. I need immediate verification on my status. I am currently being held at gunpoint by a local officer who refuses to acknowledge my credentials." Reynolds' smirk faltered. His eyes darted around, realizing that she had just spoken directly into a hidden earpiece. There was a moment of silence. Then a crisp voice crackled through her earpiece, loud enough for Reynolds to hear. "Agent Carter, we have your location. Tactical units are en route. ETA, 2 minutes." Confidence visibly shattered. His grip on the gun tightened for a brief second before his hand trembled. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. Olivia remained still, her gaze unwavering. "I told you to check my credentials, Sergeant. Now it's too late." The radio clipped to Reynolds' shoulder suddenly buzzed to life. "Sergeant Reynolds, this is dispatch. We have a priority alert regarding your current stop. Stand down immediately." Reynolds' face turned ghostly pale. His gun lowered an inch as reality finally started sinking in. But Olivia wasn't done yet. "Sergeant," she said, her voice calm but laced with authority, "put the weapon away, right now." Reynolds looked around, his breathing uneven. For the first time he realized he wasn't in control anymore, and his nightmare was only just beginning. Reynolds' hands trembled as he hesitated, the weight of his actions finally dawning on him. His radio crackled again. "Sergeant Reynolds, do you copy? Stand down immediately. Repeat, stand down." Olivia remained motionless, her sharp gaze locked on him. The air between them was thick with tension. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice steady. "Holster your weapon or you'll regret it." Reynolds' arrogance had turned into something else, panic. His mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this, but deep down he knew he had already lost. The distant sound of sirens grew louder. They were coming fast. His radio buzzed again, this time with urgency. "Multiple federal units inbound. ETA 1 minute. Sergeant, if your weapon is drawn when they arrive, you will be considered a threat." Reynolds swallowed hard. He had no choice. With a shaky breath, he slowly, almost reluctantly, holstered his gun. "That's better," Olivia said coolly. "Now, hands where I can see them." The irony wasn't lost on him. Just minutes ago, he was the one barking orders, feeling untouchable. Now he was the one being commanded. But his nightmare wasn't over yet. A fleet of black SUVs screeched to a stop, their doors flying open in unison. Armed federal agents stormed out, weapons drawn, their movements precise and synchronized. "Step away from the agent," one of them ordered. Reynolds took a step back, his breath shaky. Olivia finally moved, retrieving her badge and holding it up. "Agent Carter, FBI. This officer just pulled a gun on me despite multiple warnings." The lead federal agent, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded before turning to Reynolds. "Sergeant Reynolds, place your hands on your head." Reynolds froze. You can't be serious," he stammered. The agent's voice was cold. "Now." Reynolds hesitated for half a second too long, so they grabbed him. In one swift motion, the officers twisted his arms behind his back, securing them in handcuffs. The loud click of metal locking into place sent a shiver down his spine. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. As they patted him down, Olivia leaned in, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You laughed at my badge," she whispered. "Let's see if you're still laughing when they process you." Reynolds clenched his jaw, but there was nothing he could say. The tables had officially turned. Sergeant Reynolds felt his heart pounding as cold steel cuffs tightened around his wrists. The flashing red and blue lights from the arriving squad cars painted his pale face in rapid bursts of color. Every fiber of his being screamed that this wasn't supposed to happen. "This is a mistake," he growled, his voice laced with desperation. "I was just doing my job." Olivia Carter stood tall in front of him, her dark eyes unreadable. She had seen countless men like him, officers who let their badge make them feel untouchable, who mistook authority for power. But now, Reynolds was coming to a harsh realization. Power only lasts until someone with more of it steps in. One of the federal agents patted him down, retrieving his service weapon. Another officer removed his badge from his chest with deliberate slowness. The weight of what was happening finally sank in. "Wait, what are you doing?" Reynolds demanded, struggling against the firm grip on his arms. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know she was FBI." The lead federal agent, Special Agent Matthews, gave him a cold, unimpressed look. "That's the problem. You didn't bother to find out before pulling a weapon on a federal agent. That's called aggravated assault on law enforcement. You know the penalties for that?" Reynolds paled. Olivia finally spoke, her voice controlled but firm. "You profiled me, Sergeant. You saw a black woman and assumed you had control over the situation. You didn't think for a second that you might be the one in the wrong. Well, now you get to face the consequences." A small crowd had gathered near the scene. Some people were filming on their phones, whispering among themselves. "Is that a cop in cuffs? What did he do? Wait, isn't that Olivia Carter, the FBI agent?" Reynolds's face burned with shame as realization hit. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a public reckoning. Agent Matthews motioned to the officers holding Reynolds. "Get him in the car. He's coming with us." As they led Reynolds toward a waiting black SUV, he turned his head toward Olivia one last time, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "You can't do this," he hissed. "You're ruining my life." Olivia stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so only he could hear. "No, Sergeant," she said calmly. "You did that all on your own." The door slammed shut, sealing Reynolds inside. The crowd murmured as the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. For the first time in his career, Sergeant Reynolds wasn't the one making the arrest. He was the one being taken in. The precinct was eerily quiet when the black SUV carrying Sergeant Reynolds pulled into the back entrance. Officers who had worked with him for years exchanged uneasy glances as he was led inside in handcuffs, escorted by federal agents. Detective Marcus Hayes, a veteran cop with more integrity than patience, stepped forward, arms crossed. His sharp eyes locked onto Reynolds, his expression unreadable. "What the hell did you do, Reynolds?" Hayes asked, his voice low but tense. Reynolds scoffed. "This is a mistake. They're overreacting. I didn't know she was FBI." "And that makes it okay?" Hayes cut him off, his tone sharp. "You pulled a gun on a woman who flashed her credentials, and you laughed in her face. What were you thinking?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't sure anymore. Across town, the news was already spreading like wildfire. A police sergeant arrested for pulling a gun on an FBI agent. The story had everything: racial profiling, abuse of power, and a federal takedown. Social media was ablaze with footage from bystanders, and news stations had picked up the story before Reynolds even made it to his holding cell. At FBI headquarters, Olivia Carter sat in a sleek conference room, debriefing with her superior. Special Agent Matthews leaned against the table, arms crossed. "We're getting a lot of attention on this case," Matthews said. "The Justice Department is watching. They want us to see this through." Olivia nodded. "We will. He's not walking away from this." Back at the precinct, Reynolds sat in an interrogation room, his mind racing. He had been a cop for years. How had it come to this? The door opened, and to his horror, in walked Olivia Carter. She sat across from him, her presence commanding the room. "Let's talk about what happens next," she said. Sergeant Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands still cuffed in front of him. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, casting harsh shadows on the dull gray walls of the interrogation room. Across from him, Olivia Carter sat with an air of quiet authority, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the metal table. "You know why you're here," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "I made a mistake, all right? I didn't know you were FBI." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "And if I weren't, would you have still pulled that gun on me and laughed in my face?" Reynolds didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. Detective Marcus Hayes stepped into the room, a thick case file in his hands. He tossed it onto the table in front of Reynolds. "You've got bigger problems than just pulling a gun on a federal agent." Reynolds frowned as Hayes flipped open the file. Inside were reports, complaints, and internal investigations. A history of excessive force incidents, racial profiling accusations, and abuse of power. "Looks like today wasn't your first time targeting black civilians," Hayes said, his voice edged with disappointment. Reynolds clenched his jaw. "None of that was ever proven." Olivia leaned forward. "That's the problem, isn't it? Officers like you always get away with it, not this time." The door opened again and Special Agent Matthews entered. "The Department of Justice is involved now," Matthews said. "They're considering federal charges, civil rights violations, unlawful use of force." Reynolds felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just about his badge anymore. This could mean prison. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. Olivia studied him. 2 minutes of arrogance just cost you everything. The weight of the situation finally hit Reynolds as he sat in the interrogation room, his cuffs feeling heavier than before. His heart pounded, not just from the fear of losing his job, but of losing everything. Outside, the station buzzed with quiet tension. The news had spread fast. An officer arrested for pulling a gun on an FBI agent. Some officers whispered in disbelief, while others watched in silent judgment. Meanwhile, in the chief's office, Captain Dawson paced back and forth. His face was red with frustration. An officer under his command had just humiliated the entire department. "This is a damn disaster," Dawson muttered under his breath. Olivia and Detective Hayes stood across from him. Olivia's expression remained unreadable, but Hayes had no problem voicing his thoughts. "With all due respect, Captain, Reynolds did this to himself," Hayes said. "He's had complaints for years. This time, he picked the wrong person to harass." Dawson sighed and rubbed his temples. "You think I don't know that? The mayor already called. He wants this handled before it turns into a media circus." Olivia crossed her arms. "It's already a media circus. You can't cover this up. The question is, what will you do about it?" Dawson hesitated. He wasn't known for backing down, but this was different. This wasn't just about bad optics. This was about federal-level consequences. Downstairs, Reynolds sat frozen as another officer approached his holding cell. "Internal Affairs is here," the officer informed him. "They want your badge, your gun, and they're recommending termination." Reynolds' head snapped up. "Termination!" The officer shrugged. "This time, you crossed the wrong person." As Reynolds processed the words, his mind raced. He had always believed he was untouchable. Not anymore. Reynolds sat in the holding cell, his head in his hands. The walls around him felt like they were closing in. Just yesterday, he was barking orders at suspects, treating them like they were beneath him. Now, he was the one behind bars. Outside, Olivia stood beside Detective Hayes, watching through the glass. "Do you think he understands what he's done?" Hayes asked. Olivia let out a slow breath. "I don't care if he understands. I care that he faces the consequences." The door opened and Captain Dawson entered, his face unreadable. He walked over to the cell, arms crossed. "Reynolds," he said, his voice cold. "Internal Affairs is moving forward with their recommendation. You're suspended indefinitely, and if the FBI presses charges, you're done. Period." Reynolds stood up abruptly, gripping the bars. "Come on, Captain! You know me! This is all a big misunderstanding." Dawson's eyes darkened. "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you pulled a gun on a federal agent and laughed while doing it." Reynolds' breathing grew heavy. He had thought he was untouchable, that his badge gave him power, but Olivia's badge outranked his, and now his entire career was slipping away. The door opened again, and a sharp-dressed man walked in. "Reynolds," the man said, holding up a card. "I'm from Internal Affairs. You have two choices. Cooperate, or we let the FBI decide what happens to you." Reynolds felt his knees go weak. For the first time in his life, he had no power. Reynolds slumped onto the bench inside his cell, his mind racing. Just days ago, he was an officer with unchecked authority, someone who could intimidate, manipulate, and control any situation. Now he was at the mercy of the very system he had abused. Outside, Olivia stood firm, her hands on her hips as she stared at the man who had threatened her life. "I bet you never thought you'd be on this side of the bars, huh?" she said coolly. Reynolds shot her a glare. "You think this is funny? This is my life you're messing with." Olivia tilted her head. "Funny? No. But ironic? Absolutely. I wonder how many people you threw in holding cells just because you felt like it." Reynolds clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to justify himself, but for the first time he had no words. Detective Hayes stepped in, holding a thick folder. He slapped it against the desk. "You've got bigger problems than just losing your badge, Reynolds." The officer frowned. "What are you talking about?" Hayes flipped open the folder. Inside were pages of complaints, reports, and evidence of misconduct. Unlawful stops, excessive force, false arrests. "We've been looking into you for a while," Hayes continued. "But today, you made it easy for us. When you pulled that gun on an FBI agent, you dug your own grave." Reynolds' face turned pale. "You set me up," Olivia scoffed. "You set yourself up. I was just here when it finally caught up to you." A long silence filled the room. For the first time, Reynolds felt real fear. He wasn't just losing his badge. He was about to lose everything. Reynolds sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling. He had spent years walking around like he was untouchable, but now reality had finally caught up with him. The walls felt like they were closing in as Olivia and Detective Hayes stood before him, their expressions unreadable. "You think you can just throw me away?" Reynolds spat, his voice laced with desperation. Hayes sighed, flipping through the thick case file. "No, Reynolds. You did that yourself. We just finally got the proof to make sure you answer for it." Reynolds' mind raced. He had connections. He had friends in high places, but who would stick their neck out for him now, after what he'd done? Olivia stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. You thought your badge made you powerful, that you could do whatever you wanted. But the thing about power, when it's abused, it always crumbles. Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. Spare me the lecture. You think I'm the only dirty cop out there? I was doing what everyone else does. I just got caught. Hayes shook his head. That's where you're wrong. Plenty of good officers wear that uniform with integrity, but you disgraced it, and now you're going to pay for it. At that moment, the door swung open. An internal affairs agent stepped inside. One of them, a stern-looking woman, handed Hayes a document. It's official, she said. Reynolds is being charged with excessive force, unlawful use of a firearm, and civil rights violations. The DA's office is moving forward with prosecution. Reynolds' stomach dropped. You're done, Olivia said. And trust me, you won't be laughing your way out of this one. Reynolds sat in the courtroom, his wrists shackled, his once pristine uniform replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The once confident officer now looked hollow, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and fellow officers had come to witness what would be a defining moment in the city's history. A corrupt cop finally facing the consequences of his actions. Olivia sat near the front, her expression unreadable. Daniel was beside her, his jaw tight as he watched the proceedings unfold. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, looked down at Reynolds. Officer Ryan Reynolds, after reviewing the evidence and testimonies presented, this court finds you guilty on all counts, including excessive force, unlawful use of a firearm, and civil rights violations. You abused your authority, endangered innocent lives, and showed a blatant disregard for the law you swore to uphold. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Reynolds clenched his fists, his arrogance crumbling. The judge continued, You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the room. Reynolds' face drained of color. He had expected a slap on the wrist, not this. As the bailiffs moved to escort him away, he turned toward Olivia. This isn't over, he hissed. You ruined me. Olivia stood, meeting his glare with an icy stare. No, Reynolds, you ruined yourself. The doors shut behind him. Daniel exhaled, looking at Olivia. You did it. She nodded, but her face remained serious. One case down, but there are still more like him out there, and we won't stop until justice is served. As she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment settled over her. The fight wasn't over, but today, justice had won. If you were hooked by this story and believe in justice, share this video to spread awareness. What would you have done in Olivia's place? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this. Justice matters. Let's keep the conversation going.